Back when I was about 6 or 7, we were visiting my aunt for Christmas. She had just divorced her husband. He was a hot-headed Czechoslovakian guy who had started to go a little off the deep end. He called the house multiple times over the past few days, threatening my aunt, but nothing had ever come from it. We'd kind of dealt with the temper and flare-ups the entire course of their relationship, so it wasn't really anything new. The only part that was difficult was that we were hearing him freak out through the phone, not in person. This was actually kind of nice compared to the normal routine. Try not to placate a middle-aged guy with a bad attitude. My parents and I had just immigrated to Canada, which is where the story was taking place, so we were spending the night at my aunt's before the house was ready. We were lounging for the holidays and just enjoying a little family time. There was hot cocoa, caramel popcorn, all the fixings for a good time. While my aunt was sitting in the den, she happened to glance up and saw her ex coming towards the house with a hunting rifle. She screamed to my dad with balls of steel flew into action, locking the door and then running myself, my aunt, and my mother up the stairs and then locking us in a room. We put a dresser in front of the door while my dad grabbed a buck knife and then ran back downstairs. I was in shock watching him grab a weapon and go back toward the danger. He was totally calm, ready to deliver certain death to this clown who thought he was going to surprise us. I learned in those few seconds, watching my father gather himself and then go downstairs, never to mess with that man. Never. Not even as a joke. The rest of the story I only know because it's been told to me. Basically, my mom called the police from the upstairs phone. Meanwhile, my aunt's ex busted open the door near where my dad was hiding and then entered the home. My dad waited for him to take a few steps into the main room before he jumped out from the corner and hit him over the head with something. I think my dad thought it would knock the guy out cold, but all it ended up doing was getting him to drop the rifle. This wasn't a bad alternative. My dad continued the assault, which kind of turned into a raw fist fight there in the foyer. I don't know what happened to the knife. I assumed it was involved at least in the initial back and forth scuffle, but he never confirmed nor denied if he stabbed that guy. With the look that my dad had on his face that day, I'm almost positive he knifed him at least once. The police showed up and arrested my aunt's ex. But the scariest part about all this was, my aunt's ex's father was found hiding in the backyard when the police did a sweep about the house. He was this old abusive drunk that hated my aunt too. He'd been waiting in the backyard with a knife, hoping we'd run out there. He was way scarier than his son. He had a real rap sheet of aggravated assaults and more things like that. Had my father tried to usher us out back, we would have been dead in that moment. He really saved us that day with his quick thinking and quicker action. Situational awareness is one thing, but having the brass to react is definitely something else. The father ended up getting deported. The ex went to jail and then had a restraining order for years to come. Although he still claims they only wanted to scare us, it was a horrifying experience, hearing all that commotion from downstairs while we were all hidden away. All I know is, based on my dad's bravery and the beating he must have put on that guy, we've gotten to enjoy many more Christmases. On the 25th of December in 2014, 36-year-old Dustin Lee Klopp dialed 911 from his home in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. When they asked what the nature of his emergency was, Dustin told the dispatcher that he required police assistance as a domestic disturbance had occurred at his home. He refused to elaborate any further, and when assured that the officers had been dispatched to his location, Dustin hung up the phone. Upon their arrival at Dustin's home, the police officers received no answer after knocking on his front door. The scenes of domestic disputes are often extremely noisy and extremely volatile, but in this case, there was nothing but a dead silence on the other side of the door. The officers began circling the perimeter of the house, peering into the windows before making their way into the backyard. The place seemed completely deserted, and for a moment, the officers believed they may have gotten to the wrong address. Just as they were about to radio dispatch for some more clarification, one of the officers passed a small shed Dustin had kept in his backyard and detected the telltale smell of rotten flesh emanating from its interior. After fetching a pair of bolt cutters from their patrol car, the officers gained access to the shed, and after a brief search, discovered a dismembered human corpse stuffed into a gym bag. It was quickly determined the deceased was Stephanie Kilhefner, the common-law wife of Dustin Lee Klopp, and soon after, the police officers came to a horrifying conclusion. Dustin had absconded with the couple's 2 daughters, and if he'd murdered their mother, there was no telling what he had planned for them. Local law enforcement rushed into action, setting up roadblocks while requesting additional units from neighboring counties. Within just a half an hour, a gigantic web of roadblocks and police patrols sought to trap Dustin in Lancaster County, but the effort proved fruitless. Because right around the same time the entire county was being sealed off, Dustin simply walked into a state police barracks and handed himself in. "My name is Dustin Lee Klopp," he told the officers at the front desk, "and I just killed my wife." As they escorted him into an interview room, homicide detectives were struck by how calm Dustin was and how he remained that way as he described the events of the previous night. At around 10 p.m. on Christmas Eve, Dustin and his wife began to argue. Their relationship had already been steadily unraveling, but the copious amounts of alcohol exacerbated an already tense situation until the atmosphere became downright volatile. Dustin explained how his wife had started to fiercely berate him after he attempted to walk away from the argument. Stephanie then directed so many vile insults at Dustin, he claimed to simply snap. He saw red and attacked her. With one single strike, Dustin knocked Stephanie unconscious, and as she lay before him groaning, she gradually came around. But he knew there was no turning back now. Stephanie would use this incident to financially and socially destroy him. She'd take the kids, she'd take the house, and she'd take almost half of his salary for as long as he continued to hold the job. This drunken mistake would prove nothing short of catastrophic for him, unless he committed the unthinkable. At that, Dustin walked into the family's kitchen, retrieved the sharpest knife that he could find. He kneeled next to his wife's body, brought the blade up to her throat, sliced open her jugular in a spray of fresh blood. He then walked into his home's backyard, grabbed a large axe he'd been using to chop wood for a smoker, then, in his own words, split her head open with it. He spent the remainder of the evening chopping up Stephanie's body, all while their 2 sleeping daughters slept peacefully upstairs, completely ignorant of the horror that had unfolded downstairs. By morning, Dustin had removed almost all evidence of the crime, all except his wife's corpse. After stuffing her remains into the gym bag and hiding it in the shed, he hoped the cold might mask the stench of death. He then drove his children over to his parents' house under the pretense of spending Christmas at their place. To them, it was a pleasant surprise, and neither party thought too much of it as Dustin drove back to home to place that fateful phone call. Overcome with guilt, Dustin briefly considered suicide. The idea of facing the media firestorm that would inevitably follow seemed far too much to bear. But instead of taking his own life, Dustin decided to face judgment. His courage only lasted a few months though, as in early 2015, Dustin hung himself in his cell at Lancaster County Prison. His attempt was interrupted by a prison guard, but the intervention came far too late. He was declared clinically brain dead just a week later, slipping away shortly after life support was withdrawn. Crimes like this are a prime example of why restraint and de-escalation are so important. When Dustin lost his temper with his wife, he not only lost the moral high ground, he kicked off a chain of events that would end in both of their deaths. At a time when families should be coming together, putting aside their differences to spend quality time together, Dustin Lee Klopp chose to doom his own. I was driving from Cheyenne up to Butte, Montana, and the first part is generally windy with chances of the road closing due to the wind being common. I was about half a mile behind a pickup truck, pulling a travel trailer, when I saw that it started to get loose. I myself regularly pulled a 28-foot travel trailer myself, and had spent a few days and nights sitting in Douglas, Wyoming, waiting for the winds to die down so I could finish my drive. When I say winds, I mean catastrophic air movements, sometimes upward of 75 miles per hour. The southern belt of Wyoming can actually be a record setter for winds. The average is usually over 50 miles per hour for the year. Casper held the highest rate of suicide per capita in the world, and there's barely 60,000 people living there. Many attribute this to the wind driving them crazy, day after day. Anyway, I start mumbling to myself about using the trailer brakes to straighten it out, when he went sideways and into the center of the divided highway. It jackknifed and rolled, so I yelled some curses. I was a brand new dad at the time, so I'd been thinking extra about my own mortality. There's nothing like someone else on the road, not just putting themselves at risk, but everyone else around them too. I'm a former EMT, so I was preparing myself to help save some guy's life when I rounded the corner and saw it. The truck was on its side. He had landed on the driver's head, partially detached outside of the vehicle, with his body inside and a small section of ligament keeping it attached. Basically, his head smashed through the driver's window of this truck as it rolled, and then the truck decapitated him as it shifted on its side along the roadway. I could see a path of blood where the open wounds had dug through the snow. At the end of this little bloody trail is a severed human head, still bleeding while the snow lands in its hair. I look in the front window and saw no one else inside, and slowly walked back to my truck, mumbling about who knows what. I called law enforcement, explained the situation in the scene, and then the location. I asked if they needed me to stay, and dispatch told me no. My information was enough. I drove a long way in silence. I even cried some thinking about my 8-month-old boy and what his life would be like without me. I saw myself driving that truck and hauling that trailer, as that's how my wife and I lived for about 8 years. We pulled that thing all over, rain or shine, any time of the year. Count your blessings. First off, I'm living very rural, in a small village with maybe 10 to 15 houses, but close to the highway. You can drive there within maybe 5 minutes. It's also about 10 minutes away from town. If you cross the street, it just takes you about a 10-minute walk to reach the forest. First Christmas Day, in the afternoon, my partner and I decided to go for a little digestive walk. We were really stuffed from all the food. It was around 5 p.m. and already dark when we left. We had this big and bright LED flashlight with us, and I also took my camera and my flash, as I love taking pictures of nature at night. We decided to walk on a little country road towards the forest, and then turn right, following a small gravel cycle track close to the forest border, which connects our village and the next. In the middle of the part of the track, you have to walk through a small bit of forest. It's rather dark and the trees are very high and quite dense. When we entered, I saw my flashlight reflecting on something and recognized a car being parked there on the side of the track, close to the trees. This struck me as odd. Cars are not allowed to drive there, and the path is very narrow and hidden, so I was a bit cautious. My partner pointed the light inside of the car, and it seemed to be empty. I also noticed that the windows were frozen, so it must have been parked there for quite some time. A bit in front of the car, I spotted a tree with this intriguing structure. I asked my partner to point the flashlight toward it, so I could better focus and photograph it with my flash. After I took a few images, my partner told me, there's someone standing behind us in the middle of the road. He's looking at us. Nobody was following us that whole way until now. I'd looked behind me occasionally, because at this time in the evening and so close to the border of the forest, there's sometimes boars. Indeed, now there was a man standing behind us, staying just out of the flashlight's reach. He wasn't saying anything, just standing there and facing us. At first, I thought he might be startled, as it may seem a bit weird if someone's just taking photos around your car. I decided to get up and confront him from a distance, explaining to him that I was just taking photos of that tree. He didn't react, he just stood there. I then went on to ask him if he needed some light, and he replied that that wasn't necessary. It was odd, but I was still calm. Sure, there has to be a normal explanation for all this behavior. Nonetheless, my partner and I just decided to get out of there and follow the path leading to the next village. I remembered the letters on his license plate and Googled it. It turned out he was from a city about 6 hours away from us. Mind you, the country that I live in is in a very strict lockdown right now, so you're only allowed to travel even by car if you have very urgent reasons. After we reached the first lantern in the next village, we looked back and observed the car driving a bit out of the forest, turning around and then going back inside. I was able to see that he parked there again and turned the lights off. He didn't leave the forest. We went home on a much longer way than initially intended, and I didn't want to go back there for obvious reasons. Our flashlight battery died on the way, and my phone battery was low, so I didn't want to call the police back then, but I called them as soon as I arrived home and gave them all the details that I can remember. I think I was very lucky to have my partner and that camera, as well as that bright light with me. I don't want to imagine what could have happened if I was all alone. About 5 years ago, my mom started dating a guy that she'd met on a dating site. The online dating is fine. I had recently started dating a woman who would later become my wife, and we'd met online as well. Both my girlfriend, who would later become my wife, and myself never liked this guy. We thought he was a weirdo literally from day one. We didn't think he was mean or anything like that, just creepy. He was quiet. He kept his eyes closed a lot, occasionally saying odd things, like offering my wife a chocolate, then popping one in his mouth and closing his eyes, then moaning as he let it melt in his mouth. It was all stuff that just teetered on inappropriate, but also kind of reminded me of special needs individuals I personally known as well in my life. I don't mean that in a disparaging way in the slightest, just in the sense that I wondered how much control this guy had over his thoughts and his words. One time my wife and I were visiting my mom, but she got called into work, so we waited at her house. Her boyfriend was over, and he spent the entire several hours that night just hanging out in her bedroom with the door closed. We could hear noises every now and again, but for the most part, it sounded like he was just lying totally still in there. Really creeped us out because we didn't know what to do. We ended up just waiting it out, but maybe be a little bit more of a host next time. Just before Christmas, my mom and this guy start having some difficulties. My wife and I were visiting for the holidays. She dropped all of her problems on us, and we listened carefully, gave our opinions, and suggested that she might be better off without him. She had already made her mind up, though, and decided to break up with him on Christmas Eve. I couldn't help but smile. Of course, she'd been lying out this entire plan, down to the day of when to do it, and then explained it to us purely for confirmation. What I was smiling about was that she'd already lured us into the house for the holiday weekend. We're going to be stuck in the crossfire after she dumps this guy. All I can imagine is him quietly collecting his belongings before murdering us in our sleep. Thanks, Mom. We spent the night at my mom's and got up early on Christmas morning to visit my dad at his house. We didn't plan to spend the night at my dad's, but we got snowed in, which was actually a nice Christmas surprise. We had avoided the entire breakup conversation the night before, and then got out of there pretty much the moment the sun rise, and we were happy to be now stuck in my dad's. The next day we left as soon as we could, to get through the snow. My wife suggested that we stop by my mom's house on the way, make sure that she was okay. My wife just had a really bad feeling about that ex-boyfriend. I couldn't blame her. That whole weekend was like a perfect murder setup. It was a holiday weekend, fresh blankets of snow, family members coming and going, adding to the chaos. With my mom and that guy snowed in alone, the reality became more clear that there was potentially danger at hand. My mom's car was in the driveway, but that doesn't really mean much. She lives close enough to work that she actually walks often. She never locks her door, which drives me crazy, so we let ourselves in. That's when we see blood oozing out of the refrigerator's water dispenser. It had filled up the spill container and was leaking onto the floor and made this giant puddle. My wife screamed and I freaked out. I fully expected to see my mom's head in the freezer. The house is caught in this eerie half-light. No sound or movement. There doesn't seem to be anyone around. I holler both of their names into the house and get no response. A sour pit is churning in my stomach, and I'm starting to really entertain the idea that the worst has happened. It's not hard to do when you're seeing exactly what you didn't want to see. I nervously opened the freezer to find a bag of frozen cherries that had been opened, crammed into the freezer so that it fell onto the ice dispenser and then melted. My mom turned out to be in the shower just warming up. Ex-boyfriend was nowhere to be found. We told her about the cherry incident, to which she gave us this funny look and asked us to show her. She claimed she never even bought frozen cherries. Didn't have any. Those weren't hers. We think the ex-boyfriend bought them, opened them, and then arranged them in the freezer so they'd thaw and drip, like a weird, ominous power move. For Dayton, Ohio, Christmas time of 1992 would become synonymous with a group whose name would haunt the city for many, many years to come. The Downtown Posse. Since their meeting during a night of drinking just 2 weeks prior, 22-year-old Marvalis Keene and his 16-year-old girlfriend Laura Taylor had been inseparable. Laura had recently been kicked out of her parents' house. She had no job and had quickly become financially dependent on Marvalis, who had burned through what little cash she had, keeping her entertained. Around 2 weeks before Christmas, the couple spent the last of their cash on a single night stay in a downtown Dayton hotel and were desperate for money. Fortunately, Laura had an idea. She knew a man named Joseph Wilkerson who had a rather lucrative job at General Motors, a man who spent a sizable amount of his disposable income on sexual deviancy. The plan was simple. Laura would call Joseph, invite him to an orgy in exchange for a sizable amount of cash. Once they knew he had the cash on hand, they could get into his home with the help of a fellow member, Heather Matthews, and rob him. But the raid turned into something far more horrific than a simple smash and grab. On Christmas Eve, once Marvalis, Heather, and Laura had forced their way into Joseph's home at 3321 Prescott Avenue, they tied him to a bed with electrical cord, torturing him until he gave up the cash. But once the money was secured, Marvalis used a .32 caliber Derringer to execute their victim, so he couldn't report them to the police. After the murder, the trio made themselves at home, raiding Joseph's fridge and playing loud music before stealing his car, which now facilitated their killing spree. What came next can only be described as a frenzy of violence. The next victim was Danita Gillette, who was shot multiple times while using a payphone at 517 Neal Avenue. There was no plan this time. It seemed like they just shot a totally random person in the middle of the street before jumping out of a stolen car and taking her shoes, jacket, and a backpack. After they were apprehended by the police, the surviving members of the downtown posse would admit that the sole motivation for Danita's cold-blooded murder was to steal her brand new sneakers. The third victim that night was a man named Jeffrey Wright, who was shot 4 times while standing outside of 157 Yuma Place. Thankfully, he was lucky enough to survive the attack, but as it turned out, Jeffrey had a personal connection to the group. He was the ex-boyfriend of Heather Matthews, who was, by that time, in a relationship with another downtown posse member, DeMarcus Smith, and it was he who pulled the trigger 4 times, hitting Jeffrey in both legs. Fortunately, he was able to escape to a neighbor's house and get himself some medical assistance. The downtown posse then rested for the night, but planned on resuming their spree the very next day. As the sun set on Christmas Day 1992, the group had decided on their next victim, a man named Richard Maddox, and he too had a connection to the posse. He was Laura Taylor's ex-boyfriend, who was lured from his parents' house with the promise of reconciliation. He picked her up in his car, and the pair then drove around discussing their past relationship. But unbeknownst to Richard, the rest of the downtown posse followed close behind. Richard soon figured out that he was being tailed. He grew nervous and attempted to make a quick getaway. And that's when Laura put the Derringer pistol to his head and pulled the trigger, killing him instantly. Then, as the car was about to crash, Laura threw herself out of the moving vehicle and was then picked up by the fellow gang members. On the following day, Sarah Abraham was working at the family-owned Shortstop Mini Market on West 5th Street when the posse entered the store. Once again, Laura Taylor seemed to be leading the group in selecting their victims, scouting ahead and entering the store first to ensure that they would not be overwhelmed or outnumbered. She was followed by DeMarcus and Marvalis, who shot Sarah in the face before wounding a customer who was just picking up groceries. Sarah would survive for 5 days in the hospital, but eventually she would succumb to the complications stemming from those wounds. Immediately following that Shortstop shooting, the posse made their way to Salem Avenue, where they found a woman airing up her tires at a gas station. As soon as the woman saw them approaching with guns drawn, she fled. But it wasn't this that saved her life. It later came to light that Laura Taylor had demanded that Marvalis shoot her as soon as she ran, but he hesitated, and the woman was able to make her escape. It's a highly disturbing detail that the youngest and seemingly most innocent of the 4 was evidently the most bloodthirsty. The posse then stole the woman's black Dodge Shadow, the same car that was pulled over in a traffic stop that led to their arrest. In the aftermath of them being apprehended, the group told the police where to find 2 more bodies, those of Wendy Cottrell and Marvin Washington. Their bodies were at the city-owned gravel dump, located at 1654 Richley Drive. These 2 were members of the posse that Laura Taylor ordered the execution of, because she believed they knew too much and would break under police pressure. They told the two soon-to-be victims they all wanted to party and told them to get in the car. A short while later, Marvalis pulled the car over into the gravel pit, ordered Wendy and Marvin to get out, and then he and DeMarcus shot them in cold blood. It's terrifying that the downtown posse quickly went from killing for financial gain to just killing for the thrill of it, and all during the most festive time of the year, when families of the victims would have been extra devastated to learn their loved one's demise, given that Christmas is such a family-oriented holiday. Perhaps the only solace we can take in this case is to learn that Marvalis Keene was executed for his part in the murders, and the families of the victims managed to get some measure of justice.